How about the carpet and the pews? Have you noticed that? These last few weeks, Kevin Walters has been spot cleaning and refreshing the carpet and the pews, and he's done a great job. It really looks better. So thank you, Kevin. As we get into Romans 11 this week, Paul continues to talk about the Israelites' response to the Messiah, which is one of his themes from Romans 9 through 11. And that's going to eventually lead us into a discussion of grafting, which you heard about in the reading just a moment ago. But I want to make sure we understand how Paul gets to this conversation about grafting. So if we look at the beginning of Romans 11 in verses 5 and 6, he says, "So too at the present time there is a remnant chosen by grace. And if by grace, then it cannot be based on works. If it were, grace would no longer be grace." And that is actually what Scripture says, but it seems to be kind of an obviously moment for Paul. He's been spending so much of Romans talking about grace, talking about how we don't earn our salvation. It is a gift from God, that as he's talking about the difference between the Jewish response and the Gentile response to the gospel, he wants to still come back to this idea that grace has to be grace. So he goes on to explain that the Jewish rejection actually works for the good of all humankind because it brings the Gentiles into the fold, and it might motivate the Jewish people to also believe in Jesus. This is what he writes in verses 11 and 12 about what he calls full inclusion. "Again, I ask, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? Not at all. Rather, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. But if their transgression means riches for the world, and their loss means riches for the Gentiles, how much greater riches will their full inclusion bring?" And so again, Paul returns to this idea that his hope is for Israel to be saved. And that leads us into the conversation about grafting that we're going to return to in a moment. I'm no expert on grafting, but I happen to know someone who is. She works at the University of California, Davis in the program that breeds new varieties of plums for the use as prunes. And this is one of the varieties that she's created. And we're going to watch what my cousin Sarah Castro has to say about grafting while I have a little snack. This is my cousin Sarah. Sarah, thanks for joining us to help us understand grafting.
No problem.
So tell us a little bit about what you do at UC Davis. We have a lot of Purdue farms in Indiana, but you're at a UC Davis farm right now, right?
Yes. So I work at UC Davis as a plant breeder. I breed prune trees for the dried plum industry.
Okay. And when you do that, you were telling me about this a minute ago. If you're trying to create a new variety of prunes or plums, how does that start? And then how does grafting come into play?
Right. So when we do tree breeding, we take the pollen from one tree and put it on the flower of another tree. And that makes a seed that is genetically unique. And those seeds we plant and evaluate them to see if they're going to be new, good varieties for the industry. So we will select one that is the best out of all the crosses that we've made. And from that one tree, we'll make an orchard worth of trees. And in doing that, in making that orchard, it's all through grafting. So we don't have to make another genetically unique seed. In this case, we take a rootstock and graft the trees so they're all the same. And many of the farmers out there will know that it's a lot easier to farm something that's all very similar. And a uniform orchard is an easier orchard to farm. So
okay. And do you ever then can you even take a branch off of a tree that's grown that way and then regraft it someplace else? Is that something you ever do?
yes, definitely. So, I had a friend who had a really great peach tree in her parents' backyard, and she wanted a peach tree. So I got a different peach rootstock that was good for her backyard. and created a new tree for her with the rootstock that fits her her environment and the scion, the top, the variety that she liked. And so we've made her a new tree that way so she could have the same kind of peaches that her parents had in her backyard, in their backyard.
That's really cool. So what would you say is the hardest thing about getting a successful graft?
So there's a few things that you have to have when you have a good graft. You have to line up the cambiums. This is where the cells divide. So you have to line those up just right. You need the cut to be clean. So meaning not a jagged cut. You want it to be as fine as possible so that those cells can fuse together and start to multiply in harmony, so to speak, and start to regrow. So you need clean cuts, you need to match the cambiums, and you need to keep things tight. So we wrap them with twine or tape or something to keep the cambiums tight together so the cells can reproduce and it's just easier if they're tight. And also we have to keep the water in. If it gets too hot and the trees get the graft gets too dry, things will dry out and it just won't work. So those are the what I would tell people in grafting classes: keep it tight, clean cuts, match the cambiums, and don't let it dry out.
I'm not sure I could do it myself now, but it sounds like good advice that a knowledgeable person could use. So thank you.
And there's lots of different kinds of grafts, and nursery people do it on a really small scale with really young trees, and some people do it with bigger trees depending on what you need it for. So,
but not the kind of thing where you use a chainsaw to make the cut, right? It's got to be way more delicate than that.
Usually that is correct. You can't, I mean, a few crazy peach growers in the Fresno area do that, but I would not recommend that.
Okay. All right. Good to know. Well, hey, thanks for sharing your expertise with us about grafting to help us understand the process a little bit better. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Anytime. So I have this root, what we call a rootstock. So this is a peach tree that has good roots, but not good fruit. And then this is a stick of the good tree. And so I am going to stick this top good fruit tree on top of the rootstock, and it's gonna grow together and make Mrs. Wong a tree for her backyard. So first what I do is I get some tools. I have clippers, I have a knife. Now, this is a very sharp knife, and it's just for parents to use. It's not for kids to try without parents saying it's okay. So this is a very sharp knife. And then I have my sticks, and I have some tape. Some like kind of stretchy ribbon that's plastic. And so what I do is I take my rootstock, and I actually, you know what? The first thing I do is I cut my top. So I cut it and what I do is I make a really long flat cut. So I teach grafting at UC Davis for people who want to learn about making trees. And I always tell them you have to have a really flat, clean cut for it to work. So then I have my scion, my peach tree, that Mrs. Wong's peach tree that she wants. And then I cut a really similar cut on my rootstock right here. And I want this part, this cut, to look the same as this. And then I put them together. So it's hard to see, but I wedged them together and called a whip and tongue graft. And the sides meet up, and they're going to start to grow together. So now that they're all lined up and ready to go, I take some of this tape and I tape it together. All right, once that's all taped, this tape is keeping the cuts from drying out. We don't want them to lose any water, and it's also keeping it tight so the cells of the plants can start to grow together.